Welcome to Nottingham Contemporary. My name's Sam Thorne. I'm the director here. It's a great pleasure to be introducing Slavs and Tatars and a performance lecture titled Transliterative Tease. Before we started, I wanted to just say thank you to Backlit. This is a collaboration with Backlit, and it coincides with the final day, I believe, of an exhibition, Mountain of Tongues, of which Slavs and Tatars was a part. Slavs and Tatars is an internationally renowned art collective founded in 2006, and I realized today I think I've been kind of following really from the early days, I think, so 12 years. They've been described as archaeologists of the everyday. Their work is devoted to issues of language in an area to the east of the former Berlin Wall and the west of the Great Wall of China, an area known as Eurasia. Their practice is based on three activities: exhibitions, publications, and lecture performances, like the one we're going to experience this evening. In addition to their translation of the early 20th century Azeri satirical periodical, Mulla Nasruddin, Slavs and Tatars have published 8 books to date. Their most recent is titled Ripped Script and is published earlier this year by Hatya Kantz. That book is about alphabet politics and transliteration. The largest presentation of their work to date is currently on view in Dresden at the Albertinum, and it's called Made in Germany, and it's on view through till the middle of October. Prior to that, they've had solo exhibitions at MoMA in New York, SALT in Istanbul, Kunsthalle Zurich, and the Secession in Vienna, besides many other places, and have participated in biennials including Guangzhou, Sharjah, and Berlin. So, Transliterative Tease, tonight's lecture performance, focuses on the Turkic languages of the former Soviet Union, as well as the eastern and western frontiers of the Turkic sphere, namely Anatolia and Xinjiang and Uyghuristan. Through the lens of phonetic, semantic, and theological slippage, Transliterative Tease explores the potential for transliteration as a strategy of both resistance and research. It delves into concepts of identity politics, colonialism, and faith. And so now please join me in welcoming Slavs and Tatars.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Sam and Matthew and the Backlit and Nottingham Contemporary teams for bringing us out and showing the work in Nottingham. Tonight's lecture performance really looks at a particular form of language called transliteration, and transliteration is really a kind of younger sibling to translation, right? Translation is noble. There's departments of universities dedicated to it. Nabokov did it. Baudelaire did it. Edgar Allan Poe did it. But transliteration is a transactional, almost trashier equivalent, right? Nobody pays much attention to it, but if you speak, read, or write a non-Latin-based language, a Roman script language, you're often doing it, whether it's Greeklish for Greeks or Finglish for Farsi-speaking people. I mean, I speak Russian, but I don't really bother to type in Russian and Cyrillic. I just type in Latin letters because I haven't bothered to relearn the Cyrillic QWERTY. But before we get into it, since this is the first lecture performance we're presenting in Nottingham, I thought maybe I'd give a little bit of background as to sort of who we are. We actually started as a reading group, an unofficial reading group, just passing material back and forth amongst a group of 15 to 20 people. And as Sam mentioned, in the past, I guess, 10, 12 years, we've published several books. I think almost 10 now, but none of the books are about our practice. We were talking about this earlier. We never allowed anybody until very recently to do a catalog of us, because I considered for a long time a catalog the closest thing the art world has to insider sort of trading, because what happens is that you get an invitation from an institution, they put aside a certain budget for a catalog, you're asked, who would you like to write about you? And I ask Matthew or Sam to write about us because they're respected in the critics or the thinkers, and it's a kind of it's a kind of backslapping, because if somebody's going to write critically about us, they're not going to do it if I invite them to do so. And in fact, it's old-fashioned maybe, or new-fashioned, but I think that if somebody's going to write criticism, they should do so in organs of press that are reserved for that. So we really believe in that kind of division, or that firewall. So if you want to write critically, you do so in your own commission, so that in no way am I going to be influencing that perspective. Some of these books, I mean, this one is our most, I guess, recognized one. It's a satirical journal called Mulla Nasruddin. I'll speak about it a little bit tonight. And at Backlit, you could have seen this one, which is on the relationship between Iran and Poland from the 17th century to the 21st century. And the new one is Ripped Script, which is supposed to look like an abdomen, but it looks a bit like a butt plug, actually, I realized here. But there's an essay about, speaking of butt plugs, but there's an essay, a good essay that's related to that. Now, for us, this approach to language and language politics and our region is equally a kind of a poetic and imaginary relationship to this geographic region, because when you devote yourself to a region between the former Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China, clearly you're not, or you're sort of dismissing any ideas of being a specialist, right? You can't be a specialist of a region that large with that many languages. It's absurd. So I really push back against this idea of sort of pedagogy, and people assume sometimes, oh, you must know so much about this region. Well, actually, no. We dedicated ourselves to this region because we're dedicating ourselves to things that we don't know. And I think that's very important to understand, is that how you engage with things that you don't know, or you don't necessarily like, or don't necessarily agree with. I'm not a Slav or a Tatar, in case you're wondering, but this relationship to things outside of yourself is actually, it comes from, you can actually find it in different philosophical traditions. For example, in Islam, and one of the hadiths of the Prophet is that blessed are those who exile themselves. So this idea of expatriation is something which is very important, and sadly been recuperated by fundamentalists and terrorists, is this idea that in sort of tradition, in sort of, let's say, mystical Islam, to understand yourself, you have to go very far from yourself. And only by going very far from yourself can you understand what it is you are, who you are, where you're from. So it goes against this kind of very self-focused, interior-focused idea of, let's say, Western psychology, which is, who are you? Look deep down inside inside yourself and think what you want to do and what you want to become and who you want to be. In fact, Mencius and Confucius also have similar approaches to subjectivity, that we are many people and not one. And this idea of sort of sincerity and singularity is a relatively misleading, if not destructive, pressure. Now, when you're interested in a region of the world which is relatively obscure, I would argue that people know more about what's happening on the planet of whatever Star Trek than they do, or Star Wars, than they do in Tajikistan or Azerbaijan. So you have to kind of meet your audience halfway. And part of that means sort of resuscitating certain historical ideas. And resuscitation is a word that we use carefully, because resuscitation implies an affective, sensual approach to the subject matter, because you actually have to put your lips onto the lips of the subject matter and breathe life into it, or and there's this idea of disrespect to resuscitation, because the person didn't ask you. It's not a French kiss, right? The person didn't ask you to put your lips on their lips, but it's a question of urgency. You have to do it, otherwise it won't really have an agency. And I think this idea of respect and disrespect is an important kind of way to look at research. I know Walid Rad recently was joking that sort of today, research-based artists is like yesterday's YBAs. Everybody's an RBA, because everybody says they're doing research. And I think it's important that when you do research as an artist, you have to at some point break the research, meaning you have to disrespect the sources at some point. And to disrespect the source, you have to respect it. And to respect it, you have to disrespect it, because otherwise, the question is, what do you as an artist bring to the table that an academic, a scholar, an NGO, or an activist is not bringing to the table? And I think that's where the artist's contribution to the subject matter, or the propos is almost like undoing the thread of a sweater, right? Is that if our lectures, like tonight, and our books articulate a certain series of concerns, then the artwork or the exhibition has to disarticulate those very concerns. So like in those sort of bad detective whatever series where the dog is looking for the trace of the criminal and goes to a pond, and it's all somebody has to do is go like this in the water, and the dog loses the trace. I think to some extent that's what the artwork has to do vis-a-vis the other strands of our practice. Now, another person who sort of disrespects the sources is this figure of Mulla Nasruddin, who's also the namesake of the periodical that we translated in 2011. Now, Mulla Nasruddin is a 12th century sort of wise man fool. He's in Western literature, the closest thing would be, I guess, the Brothers Grimm or La Fontaine's fables, because parents tell children stories about Mulla Nasruddin as a way to impart lessons of wisdom, of perspective, and he's found everywhere there was a significant Muslim population. So everywhere from Croatia to China, down to Somalia, Sudan, there's a version of Mulla Nasruddin. And he's a kind of wise jester in the sense that a typical Mulla Nasruddin story is Mulla Nasruddin is on one side of the river, and somebody yells, "Mulla Nasruddin, how do I get to the other side of the river?" And he says, "You are on the other side of the river." So like through very, very first-degree humor, he unpacks quite complex issues. And he's become a kind of latter-day mascot of ours because we really believe in this idea of asking stupid questions to smart subject matter, or using what I call stupid media. And stupid medium is, as you can see in Backlit, a balloon is a very stupid medium. You know, our current cycle of work is about pickle politics, and the pickle is a really stupid product. It's very kind of populist and stupid, right? It's just like it's salt, water, and a cucumber, and it's used in all kinds of as a substitute for all kinds of stupid things. You know, the penis and that and this, and so and this position that Mulla Nasruddin has, he's often depicted riding backwards on his donkey. And this position is a position that we call, after a scholar, actually Antoine Compagnon, who teaches at Columbia and at the Collège de France, he wrote a book called The Anti-Moderns. And we call it a kind of anti-modernist position. Now that doesn't mean we're against modernity. That would be ridiculous. It's not that we don't use technology or it's just that we don't necessarily believe in the wholesale paradigm shift that modernity is somehow purported to put forward, which is that if you believe sort of Marx, Weber, Durkheim, or any combination of those, or Freud, that somehow modern man is different than pre-modern man or woman, meaning that somehow science has made tradition or religion irrelevant, industry has made craft irrelevant. And I think that this idea of the anti-modern is best portrayed the way that Compagnon talks about it. He traces it in 19th century French literature. So he traces it from like Péguy and Chateaubriand all the way to Barthes and Baudelaire. And he says that basically the true modernists are not those people who believe that the future will deliver us from our sort of weaknesses and our sins. So they're not the Mayakovskis, they're not the Marinettis, they're not the Elon Musks of the world. But the true modernists are those people who are driving into the future, as sort of Sartre describes Baudelaire, driving to the future, but with an eye on the rearview mirror. So always unsure of what the past, the resolution of the past. And of course, you can find this trope again in Benjamin's Angel of History, who's being propelled toward the future, but looking at the sort of the rubble of the present and the past. Where else? And even in the way that we describe, the languages that I speak, sadly, are Indo-European, but the way we describe the future is always is ahead of us and the past is behind us. So that itself implies the positivism of our language, right? That somehow that we know where we're going because the future is ahead of us and the past is irrelevant, otherwise it wouldn't be behind us. And if anything, the past 10 years have shown us that's definitely not the case. And Nasruddin is always sort of, actually my other favorite Nasruddin anecdote is they ask Mulla Nasruddin sort of, why are you always riding backwards on your donkey? And he says, well, there's no point in both of us looking in the same direction. And this is an interesting way to think about it because we came across in the Malgache language, actually the language of Madagascar, they describe the future spatially as behind you and the past is in front of you. So a different way, I would argue a more accurate way of describing sort of ideas of positivism and progress, and et cetera. Now, we did a Mulla Nasruddin piece, actually, and the first thing that kids do when they get on this Mulla Nasruddin piece is reenact that very density of questions of progress, of history into a very simple ride. I mean, first of all, why are all of the rides outside of supermarkets American sort of colonialist rides? Like, why do you have in Poland cowboys and Indians outside of grocery stores when you have actually traditions, local traditions? But also, the child, of course, first thing the child asks is, why am I holding an old man's belly? You know, like, why am I not holding the back? And so the parent has to actually reenact all those different sort of versions of a Nasruddin story, latter-day Nasruddin story, to the sort of unwitting adolescent. Now, this disrespect and respect is something that we call the metaphysical splits. So, like, not the splits of the legs, which I can't do, definitely not in genes, but the splits of the mind. So how can you bring two things that are normally considered antithetical, mutually exclusive, into one idea, to two different voices, two different registers, two different traditions, into one page, into one space, into one register, into one voice? And all the English terms for this, actually none of them are English, most of them are Latin, but amphibole, of course, means sort of two contradictory phrases in one sentence. Coincidentia oppositorum is an interesting one because it's actually a Catholic or Christian idea that to describe the transcendent or God, you have to use the language of irrationalism or a paradox. You can't describe the otherworldly with this world's language. And it's one area where I would say sort of Russian intellectual history overlaps with Islam, is that both those traditions believe that the transcendent is irrational, whether it's Dostoevsky's novels, whether it's novels of 19th century Russia, or Sufism and so on and so forth. Now, an early example of this kind of transliteration is, I mean, you guys are mostly, I guess, native English speakers, or if not fluent English speakers, but dig the booty of monoglots, but marry my child a polyglot. Now, normally when somebody starts the sentence with dig the booty, they don't end with polyglot or monoglot. They're different registers of language, right? One is from the street, the other one is from the academy, or more esoteric, or more whatever official. This is not translated, it's transliterated for those of you who can read Cyrillic. So it's dig the booty of monoglots, bat, because there's no in Russian, so you have to say bat, marry, and same in the Persian Arabic script here. Now, this transliteration is, if you think about, I mean, we believe in sort of Paul Ricoeur's approach to translation, which is that translation is a form of Abrahamic linguistic hospitality. That is, you are you're basically inviting the other into your language, and you're expropriating yourself into the language of the other. And if that's the case, then the question of what is transliteration? If translation is linguistic hospitality, what is transliteration? And by the way, Macron, the current president of France, actually studied with Ricoeur in Chicago, or was doing research for Ricoeur in Chicago. And this bringing together of two different traditions is something that really accompanies our geographic remit, right? Is that the former Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China, as a curator of our show in Dresden recently pointed out, I never thought about it, but they're two very anachronistic walls. I mean, I know that these walls you don't normally put together, but they also have two accompanying geopolitical narratives. The narrative of the 20th century being communism, and the narrative of the 21st century being political Islam, right? We're not the first, and definitely not the last people, but it's something which has become a little bit common parlance, thankfully, in the past 3 or 4 years, is that really political Islam has occupied that role that communism did in the 20th century, meaning that it's filled in that vacuum where, if you were a disenfranchised young person in the banlieue in Paris in the 70s, you were most likely to join a Trotskyist group. And that option is no longer viable, so as Olivier Roy would argue, it's not about the radicalization of Islam, but about the Islamization of radicalism, in fact. And that's an important but different distinction. Now, again, why bring Islam and communism together? I mean, normally you wouldn't put Marx and Muhammad together, or Ali even. Definitely if you don't want Molotov cocktails thrown through your window. But Marx is really this kind of shoo-shoo of the left. I like to think of Marx as or our relationship to Marx is a little bit like a relationship to an abusive spouse. You know, we leftists kind of keep coming back to Marx, not thinking that it's going to be fine this time, but not understanding that it's important to just make a break and think otherwise. And Muhammad is considered to be, wrongfully as well, this kind of symbol of right, of conservatism, which is not necessarily the case either. Now, one of the people that also put these two ideologies together is a gentleman named Norman Brown. And Norman Brown is a really interesting figure who was actually quite a well-known figure in the 50s and 60s in the Anglophone world in the UK, and he's actually British, I think, but lived in the States most of his life. And Norman Brown was a professor of comparative literature at University of California, Santa Cruz, and he was a specialist of Blake, and he was a kind of a Marxist specialist of Blake, but he became a kind of crossover success, one of these people that one of these very few academics that was in the pages of the New Yorker, and really kind of the literati read him. And he was a symbol of the flower power generation. Even though he himself was not part of that movement, he never did drugs himself, but he wrote a book called A Love's Body, where he psychoanalyzed the whole of history. And that became his kind of crossover success. But the last 10 years of his life, 20 years of his life, I guess from 1980, early 80s to 2002, he devoted to reading the Quran. And he did so not because he converted, he remained a Methodist all his life, but he believed that the Quran was a kind of proto-modernist text, and that we didn't have, in translation, in the Anglophone world or the Francophone world, we didn't have the tools to understand the Quran until the arrival of James Joyce, because we didn't know what modernist literature was. And if you think about it, so he would say, like, okay, for example, unlike the Old and New Testament, the Quran's relationship to time is cyclical, right? There's no teleology, there's no A to B to C. You know, you're jumping forward, then you're jumping backwards. Similarly with characters, you have this kind of transmogrification of characters. You change from one page to the next. Jesus is Haggard is Muhammad, Muhammad is Moses. And in the Old and New Testament, Jesus is Jesus, Moses is Moses, etc. So he said that until Finnegan's Wake arrived on the scene, we didn't have the tools to understand as a text, as a hermeneutic experience, what the Quran was saying, not putting aside its theological importance. And he goes on to identify 110 of the 114 chapter headings, the surah of the Quran, in Finnegan's Wake. Now, you could probably argue that if you try hard enough, you'll find everything in Finnegan's Wake. But he went on to say, Norman Brown went on to say that he called Marxism and Islam two old political forces, two tired old horses, but that we should not take any pleasure from their failure, because Marxism and Islam agree on one thing, which is that there shall be one world or there shall be none. Now, sometimes when you say that there shall be one world, people in certain countries, namely these kind of, we're talking about these raging secularists, like countries like France and Sweden, they say, you know, have you noticed the French, they have this capacity to speak while breathing in, which I think is fascinating, you know? I've never seen anybody do that. I don't know the languages that do that. But anyway, they get shocked because they think that one world means there's only one type of world, a kind of monolithic world. Obviously, I think Norman Brown and the Quran is saying one world in the sense of one connected world, one kind of coherent world, not with less disparities or injustices or inequalities. Now, the first time we became interested in and the reason we became interested in transliteration is that transliteration sort of escapes this hermeneutic approach to language. Earlier we were talking about philology. Today, this is transliteration, and the way we think about transliteration is really a way to look at language as an affective, emancipatory, metaphysical thing, because it's only considered to be transactional today. So there must be, I really believe there's depth in the surface. And when you think about philology today, sadly enough, in the Western world, you really don't have many philology departments left. You have linguistics departments. And I think one of the reasons why we don't have philology departments is that philology was a study of language through religion, through religious texts, through literature, through history. And that has somehow been sullied by National Socialism and Nazism. But somehow philology led to questions of nationalism and superiority of language that then led to the Second World War. And so instead today we have linguistics departments everywhere, which is, for me, a bit sad. I mean, if you want to make me fall asleep as soon as possible, you just give me a linguistics book, and like where you put the tongue on the top of the roof of your mouth, Is it alveolar fricative or is it labial? I don't care. I'm not interested in language as a clinical exercise. I'm interested in language for what it reveals sort of beyond our physiological selves. And one of the first book we did on this subject was called and it looked at the sound because, well, for many reasons. First of all, unlike most phonemes, is pronounced by blocking the passage of air through your throat. Most of the time, we pronounce by pushing air through the vocal tract, and is by blocking it. Now, you can see the three chs. We focus on three different chs: the Hebrew chet, the Cyrillic ch, and the Arabic ch. And funny enough, in all three of these alphabets, ch has a certain sacred significance or valence, in the sense that chet, of course, is a kind of letter for life, but also the numerological value of chet in the Hebrew alphabet is the same as 8 and is the same as the day of the circumcision. Ch in the abjad, in the Arabic abjad, has a value of 100, and it's very important, and then it's Cyrillic as well. But also, I sometimes like to think that ch is a kind of anti-imperialist phoneme because Americans and English can't pronounce it. But I realized I was a bit too easy because the Dutch have a lot of ch, and they definitely were an empire. Speaking of empires who went far away. But one of the figures that really looked at ch in Russian was Khlebnikov. And Khlebnikov was really, he was considered to be the grandfather of Russian futurism. He was so he was so opposed to Italian futurism that he didn't even like to use the word futurism in Russian. He liked to use a Slavic root, which is budutyani. Budit means to be. And he was one of these interesting figures that, if you want to kind of caricature it, Mayakovsky was the jock. Everybody knows Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky was the guy who put his language in the service of the Bolshevik regime and power. And Khlebnikov was kind of the emo guy in the corner. So always sort of much more withdrawn. He had a philosophy called Zaum, meaning Transrationalism, where he also believed that Russia's intellectual history, or Russia's sort of mission, should be to look towards its Eastern traditions, meaning Turkic, Mongol, Persian, even Arabic, as opposed to, let's say, the history that Russia has, the direction Russia has chosen until recently, which is as a Western nation, right? I mean, Petersburg, St. Peter the Great, was really this idea of Russia looking towards the West and emulating the West. And it's part of the reason why I like Russians so much, is that, in essence, Russians are white people who act like brown people. And I like the way white people look, but I prefer the way brown people act. And Russians really have that in the sense that their education is purely European. They've studied the Greeks, Shakespeare, the Germans, but the way that their culture at home is, let's say, the way that they interact with each other, the way they pay for a dinner bill, their emotional life, their inner life is much closer to the Middle East, to China, and to the Caucasus than it is to Holland, Sweden, and Germany, for example. Now, Khlebnikov identified over 40 words in Slavic languages that denote shelter, that start with ch. And that's very important when you're doing sort of forensic etymologies, because what you look for is, of course, the kind of original words are sky, ground, shelter. And, of course, khane, even in Persian, starts with a ch. But Khlebnikov also believed in this idea of inner declensions of words. And this runs completely counter to the sort of Saussurean structuralist idea, which is that he believed there's a reason why letters follow other letters, that it's not just a random evolution, but that a letter has a spatial agency or responsibility vis-a-vis the other letters that surround it or follow it. Now, an example he would give is, if you look at chlam, which means junk in Russian, and you remove the L and you replace it with an R, the R has a kind of sublimating effect on the ch. And chlam becomes chram, which is a shrine. So he developed this very obscure, but also very interesting, and it was very much of the time, early 20th century. You had other people doing these kind of language experiments, whether it's Steiner or Mitrovich and others. But Khlebnikov also believed in these internal rhyming schemes, and I didn't translate this, unfortunately. I wish we had, but I'll read it to you in Russian just so you get a sense. The original Russian reads, "Nash kochin ochin azabochin, noj, atochin, tochin, ochin. And the English is pretty good. It's not really accurate, but it's a pretty good translation. Let us not be heads of lettuce. Let us not let knives upset us. And it has that kind of absurd or non-rational element of Chlebnikov within the translator's work. Now, to give a more recent example of this, in hip-hop, actually, one of the reasons why Notorious B.I.G. became quite well known was he was one of the first people to incorporate this internal rhyming schemes within his lyrics. And I'll just give you an example here.
We used to fuss when the landlord dissed us. No heat, wonder why Christmas missed us. Birthdays was the worst days. Now we sip champagne when we thirsty.
Now, Chlebnikov's philosophy of language was this idea of za'um. Za means trans or beyond, and is mentality, rationalism. And most of the time it's translated as transrationalism. That he believed in this kind of the kind of beginnings of using language as not as a way of not reducing language to a form of communication, but that language has its own, that it has its own either metaphysical, affective sort of utterances or ways of transmitting ideas. Now, za'um, we found one translation of za'um, which was beyond sense. So for our show at the moment, 2012, we thought that's a brilliant way of translating beyond sense because it has the idea of nonsense within it that Chlebnikov really believed in, but it also has Beyonce in it, which Chlebnikov would have definitely enjoyed because he didn't believe in these kind of random occurrences, whether it was in his own language or other. Now, Chlebnikov in 1921 starts to move down the Caucasus shortly before he dies, and goes to the Caspian region of Iran and supports a very short-lived Soviet republic on the Caspian Sea. Now, Iran's history, for those of you who are not familiar, is really 20th century history has been really split between English. The kind of south of Iran was never colonized, but it was under the influence of the English, and the north of Iran was always under the influence of the Russians. And he goes and he supports a gentleman named Mirza Kuchaki Jangali, and this very short-lived, I think, 10-month Soviet Socialist Republic on the Caspian Sea. And they called him a Russian dervish, not because he was a Sufi, but because he just looked so bad. He arrived basically like in rags and very emaciated, and everybody thought he was sort of he was a mystic, kind of ascetic mystic, which is what the Sufi dervishes are or were, most of them. So when we did this exhibition called Beyond Sense, when we were invited by the MoMA, we thought, well, we can't just do any old show, because normally our exhibitions are very specifically focused on a given subject matter, Iran's relationship to Poland, or language politics, or medieval advice literature for kings. This we thought, well, in some sense, our founding was directly a kind of a challenge to the MoMA's understanding of modernity. If the MoMA's understanding of modernity is sort of triumphalist, very air-conditioned, and sort of macho, then our understanding of modernity is not individualist, let's say collective, and not necessarily triumphalist, a bit defeatist. And we actually created a space within the MoMA where people would, when they'd walk in, they would have these three chets sort of dancing around a bowl of red. And even this bowl of red had this idea of a kind of these metaphysical splits I mentioned, because it was interesting to see that children would walk into the space and run towards the bowl of red, and parents would grab the child and say, no, don't move towards it. Because with this very simple gesture, or this sort of stupid gesture of red, for a child, sometimes it was connoted as just festive, like Kool-Aid or compote or a drink, a lemonade of some sort. But of course, the fountain of red also sort of looks like blood, and the use of blood as a way of sort of, as a symbol of really the instrumentalization of violence that you have in Iran, whether it's martyrdom or other places, is something that of course, as adults, we're not so comfortable with. Now, this Mulla Nasruddin I mentioned was actually the very first time that we came across the sort of devastating effects of alphabet changes. Mulla Nasruddin was a figure I mentioned, but also a satirical journal published between 1906 and 1930 in Baku, actually first in Tbilisi, then in Tabriz, but it was originally an Azeri publication, and most of its run was in Baku. It was probably the most important periodical of the 20th century Muslim world. It was read from Morocco all the way to India, and all we did was we just took the 200 odd illustrations that we felt the most relevant to an international audience and translated it into English. And what's astounding is that it was the first time that this had ever been translated in English. And the reason I find that shocking is that if we're to believe the noise which passes as wisdom today, that somehow the West is on a collision course with Islam, or that Islam has a problem with modernity, you would imagine that all the academic / political forces would be mobilized to demystify this threat, right? I mean, the same way that it was done during the Cold War, right? Cold War studies of Russia, unfortunately, were always through a defense lens. These departments of Russian in Sweden and the UK and then the US and France were largely funded or covertly, overtly, to contain the threat. And somehow that hasn't happened with Islam to that extent. And so, I mean, I ask myself, why, if this is the case, then why is the most important periodical not available in translation until we, as artists in 2011, do so? And it's not because we're brilliant researchers and we found it in the corner of a library. You can find this anywhere in Baku. The reason is, I think, very simply, is that people who go to Baku either go for like Eurovision Song Contest or oil contracts. And nobody thinks of this region as a space of knowledge production, culture, whatever you want to call it. It's very much this is one of the reasons why we devoted ourselves to this region, is that it really falls through the cracks, right? It's largely Muslim, but it's not the Middle East. It's largely Russian-speaking, but it's not Russia. And it's largely in Asia, but it's never been under Chinese rule except for Xinjiang, the western part of China. Now, the reason why Mulla Nasruddin was such an important periodical is that it was very progressive, namely on women's rights, but on a lot of other fronts as well. This, for example, is an illustration of an Azeri man beating his wife, and the same man being beaten by his Russian lover, right? So you have this kind of double standard of the relationship towards Christian women vis-a-vis Muslim women. And in fact, Azerbaijan gave women the right to vote in 1918, which is considerably earlier than most Western European nations. So it challenges that narrative, again, of Islam being necessarily repressive of women. And on another front, it was very progressive as well, is that it was the first publication to publish in Azeri, which at the time was considered to be a dialect. If anybody published in the early 20th century in that region, they published in Russian or in official Istanbul Turkish. Azerbaijani is very similar to Turkish, Istanbul Turkish, but it wasn't an official literary language really until Mulla Nasruddin put it or promoted it as such. And so you have a lot of drawings with the tongue of the Azeri man being cut out by the Russian Duma parliamentary members, and sort of a Russian tongue being sewn in its place, or children sort of asking, why do we need another tongue? We have our own tongue. But again, it was the language, the transcription of the different alphabets which really caught our eye. Because here you can see it. Mulla Nasruddin is written in Cyrillic, Mulla Nasruddin is written in Arabic, and then here it's in Latin. So on one page you have three iterations of the same language. It's crazy. It's quite schizophrenic. And the reason why is that it really goes to Soviet policy towards its Muslim population. Lenin believed the revolution of the East was to Latinize the Muslim subjects of the Soviet Union that the Bolsheviks had inherited from the Russian Empire. And that meant, and actually there were even talk of Latinizing Russian, because Latin was considered, the Latin script was considered to be the secular kind of international script. It didn't happen, of course, to anybody but the Muslims. So the Armenians, the Georgians, and the Russians, of course, never Latinized their scripts. But the Muslims did because the Bolsheviks believed that's the best way to cut them from their Islamic heritage, right? That Arabic is the vehicle of Islam. If you cut people from the Arabic script, not the Arabic language, of course, but the script, meaning that Azeri, until 1929, was written like this. And from 1929 to 1939, it was Latinized, in the interim, Stalin, of course, gets paranoid because Ataturk is also Latinized Turkey, and what he was afraid of was pan-Turkism. So he was afraid of basically like 90% of the Muslim subjects of the Russian Empire, and today the Soviet Union, today as well, the Empire, Soviet Union, and again Russia today, 90% of those Russians are Turkic-speaking Russians, meaning that the language is from the Turkic language family, in a way that you would say the Romance language family. So Azeri, Uzbek, Turkmen, Kazakh, Dagestani are all a family. And so he changed, imagine sort of asking everybody to sort of burn your books, and instead of reading right to left, you're going to read left to right. 10 years later, again, take away your books, no more Latin, keep left to right, but Cyrillic instead of Latin. And then when they become independent, most of these countries, they go back to Latin. So you have this very strange phenomenon where 3 generations can speak the same language, but they cannot read the same book. So a grandmother, a son, and a granddaughter can speak with each other, but not necessarily share the same text or write the same letter to each other because they have different script worlds. And this is I think this is a very important thing that we often imagine that alphabets are innocent, that they're somehow just happen to be associated with their language. But David Damrosch actually talks about that we live in script worlds, that our worldview and the pedagogical system and the system of values and culture in which we're raised is often within a certain script world. And you can see this in certain places, for example, in Eastern Europe, between Poland, which is Catholic and Latin, and Ukraine and Belarus, which is sometimes Catholic, but Cyrillic. And that Cyrillic world, that Latin world, of course, means more than simply a script. Now, it was so difficult for us to find a translator. It's easy to find a translator of any language to another language. What's difficult is to find a translator who reads and writes 3 iterations of his own language and can translate into another language. And we just gave up in the end. We couldn't find it, so we just had somebody translate from Azeri to Russian, and we translated from Russian into English. And we thought we should just, the famous proverb, sort of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. We thought we should just rename Azeri like Azeri, because we were going crazy trying to find people who could actually help us decipher the different iterations of the same language. So as I mentioned, if Ricoeur believes that translation is a form of linguistic hospitality, then maybe transliteration is a form of linguistic transvestism. Even transvestism is a word is kind of becoming a problematic term today. But it exists, and it essentially means putting on or appropriating the exterior sort of self-presentation of another for oneself. And so you're using it, you're not changing you're not changing the language, but you're of course changing the body in which that alphabet, or that language, exists. A good example of this is in Bukhara. Bukhara is considered to be the 4th holiest place in Islam. After Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, Bukhara. In fact, there's a hadith that says that Bukhara, it's quite beautiful, that Bukhara is one of the few places that doesn't receive light from heaven, but projects light onto heaven, because there's so many holy people who have lived there. Bukhara is in current day Uzbekistan. The epithet of Bukhara, kind of like the golden apple, I guess. Is that what called? The big apple, sorry. The big apple in New York. Bukhara is called Bukhara Sharif, which means holy or noble Bukhara. And what's interesting is that Bukhara was also home to a significant population of Jews who were called Bukharan Jews, but also all across Central Asia, whether Jews were in Samarkand or other places, they were all called Bukharan Jews. And Bukharan Jews read and write, their language is Persian, is Farsi, so my mother tongue, the language of Iran, but it's written in Hebrew. So you have this collision of 2 traditions that, again, you often don't put in the same phrase or same thought, that the script of Judaism and the language of Iran. Of course, we do know that still today, the largest Jewish population in the Middle East is in Iran, and they're free to practice. But that's not the way that it's presented to us, at least in the kind of antagonistic relationship that you have. Either you guys are very serious or very dismissive of this kind of humor. It's okay, it's good to be dismissive of this kind of humor. I don't have to explain. So sometimes people in Germany especially don't know why people would make t-shirts like this. But yes, if you've studied in the United States or you've gone to Amsterdam, you know this kind of college frat boy humor. And what it is doing is taking an important existential question, no matter how cliche it is, of to be or not to be, and it's bringing it down to a kind of a very pedestrian question of consumer or consumption, right? It's like, and the challenge is how do we regain the gravitas, the kind of existential gravitas of the original question of to beer or not to beer. In fact, there's another version which is 2 beers or not 2 beers, but it's not as good as this one, of course. But if Sam, for example, drinks a beer or doesn't drink a beer, I don't care. Go ahead and drink a beer. It makes no difference. But if you transliterate to beer or not to beer into Arabic, to beer or not to beer, you regain that question of the gravitas, because for a Muslim to drink a beer or not to drink a beer, again returns to a question of being, of identity, of belonging, of community, and of faith. So you reload into that very stupid medium again, larger questions of existence. Now, another very peculiar question of transliteration is the question of, in the First World War, there was a really interesting phenomenon. We were talking earlier about Germany's relationship to the East and to the Muslim world, because Germany, of course, arrived late to the colonial game and had a much smaller footprint of colonies than the French, the English, the Russians, or the Dutch, or the Portuguese, or the Spanish. But in the early 20th century, in 1914, actually late 19th century, it all changed when Kaiser Wilhelm starts his policy of setting the East aflame. And in the years before the First World War, he visits Damascus, and let me see if we've got his picture here. I can even show you. He visits Damascus, and he wants to lay a claim to the Holy Land. And like everybody had done, he goes to Jerusalem and Damascus, and he raises a toast to the 300 million Muslims of the world and says, Germany is your friend. Of course, little he understood about Islam if he's raising a toast to 300 million Muslims, but he says, Germany is your friend, rise up against your oppressors, and we will we'll have your back. And what he does is he goes if you go to Umayyad Mosque, he goes and gives a gift of a tomb for Saladin. And he believes that the tomb that Saladin is buried, the famous sort of warrior the warrior who famously kind of pardoned the crusaders that he'd caught and didn't sort of massacre them, he believes this is a bit too ghetto, so he brings a kind of a beautiful marble casket. And in typical kind of Middle Eastern fashion, the Ottomans sort of say thank you very much, but they don't change Saladin's tomb, they just accept it and put it there. So you go to visit the Saladin, and you have these very strange, uncanny experience where you have 2 graves, but only one says the virtuous body of Saladin, and the other one is just a gift. We took the gift, but we didn't do anything about it. And this later develops into, on the early stages of the First World War, the Germans convinced the Ottomans to declare jihad against certain non-believers, certain infidels, so against the Entente powers, being France, England, and Russia, but on the side of other infidels, which are the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, and of course on the side of the Ottomans. Now this jihad didn't succeed for many reasons, one of which is that if anybody knew anything about Islam, they knew that the Sultan no longer had any legitimacy as a spiritual leader, definitely not in the early 20th century, if he ever had it at all. But also for other reasons, it's part of a larger strategy where the Germans actually build POW camps for Muslims that they catch as a kind of propaganda camps. So they build the first functioning mosque on German soil. It's 70 kilometers outside of Berlin, no longer exists, but in a place called Wunsdorf, Zossen. Ironically, right on the same land now was one of the largest processing centers for refugees and migrants. They have games, they have halal meat, and so it's really kind of to show that if you Muslims go back, we've caught you are prisoners of war, but this is how we treat our prisoners of war. Imagine how we treat sort of Muslims on our side. So if you go back to your countries and you rise up against your colonial powers, why? Because of course almost all the Muslims of the world at that time were under the colonial power of the enemy, being France, England, and Russia. And another piece of this sort of strange pie is a newsletter for the POWs called El Jihad. And El Jihad was written in all the languages of the Muslims of the world at the time, so Arabic, Russian, Turco-Tatar, which I haven't really understood what that is yet. But what we, of course, became fixated on is how jihad is spelled. D-S-C-H. 4 letters for one phoneme, right? Why? Well, the irony is there's no j in German. So they had to create the j. And the j is D-S-C-H. And so we started to dig a bit further, and I thought, what other words in the German language are spelled D-S-C-H? So I look in the Duden, which is the German equivalent of the Oxford English Dictionary, and it's like a greatest hits of Orientalism, Jamma, the Muslim community, Djibouti, Jalaba, the North African garment, Jizya, the tax that non-Muslims have to pay. My favorite, of course, is Dschungelfieber, because Germans definitely suffer from Dschungelfieber. I mean, you have to just look at Heidi Klum and Boris Becker for that. Genghis Khan. And I thought, that's strange, because when Germans order a gin tonic, they don't write gin tonic D-S-C-H-I-N, right? Or if they go and buy jeans, they're not buying Levi's jeans D-S-C-H-E-A-N-S. So certain j are okay, because they're from our tradition, meaning Western civilization, but other j's are not okay. So it's a way of, whether it's a subconscious or not unconscious or deliberate way to mark those terms as not our culture. It's done with this kind of D-S-C-H. Now, when the jihad is declared, the English immediately retort and say, this jihad is made in Germany. This actually spells out made in Germany, and it's not because we don't have Middle Eastern Microsoft, which is why the letters are not connected. It was an alphabet by Enver Pasha, the last defense minister of the Ottoman Empire, a crazy figure in and of himself that deserves a biopic of some sort. But he believed that to help Turks or Ottomans understand better or become more literate, it would be easier to divide the letters and not have them run into each other. Because Arabic, what's difficult with the Arabic script is that each letter has a different iteration, whether it's at the beginning, the middle, or the end of a word. So you kind of have to learn all 3 iterations of each letter. Anyway, the English retort, this jihad is made in Germany. And also, that's a very weird way to criticize something. Because I can think of a lot of ways to criticize something, but made in Germany is not the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, what does that mean? It's like a highly engineered, precise jihad? Like, you buy it once and it's going to last you 20 years? Because that's what I think of when I think of made in Germany. I don't think of sort of illegitimate, I think of very technically proficient. And maybe that's what they meant, is that it's actually been engineered as opposed to being sort of organic and natural. Now, the most famous example of language politics and transliteration is, of course, the Turkish example, because if you think about it, it's remarkable that in 80 years since Ataturk Latinized the Turkish alphabet, it's a kind of open and shut case. And that's remarkable. That's because that's not a lot of time. Even the most batshit crazy Salafist in Turkey doesn't believe in bringing back the Arabic script. It's done. It's agreed upon. That's it. And why he did so, I mean, the reason why it's such an open and shut case is, I guess, speaks to the fact that it wasn't only a ideological question. Of course, he wanted to sort of peg Turkey's destiny to the West, which is why the Latin alphabet, of course, recalls that or represents that West. But also, there was a legitimate reason to do so, is because Turkish has 8 vowels, and the Arabic alphabet only has 3. Namely, the Arabic alphabet, there's no way to accommodate these weird sounds of Turkish, which look like the German, the umlaut sounds, the ö and the ü, which you have in French as well, which is this is the ö and this is the ü. There's no way to write that in Arabic script. And so he believed that, of course, if he Latinizes the alphabet, you can create these sounds, you can create these letters. But what we forget is also that we lose certain letters and certain sounds when you change an alphabet. For example, one sound which was lost, the Turks used to have 2 N's. And you can find traces of it all across the Turkish language. The 2 N's were the normal N, meaning like Nancy, niyahat, for example. Or another N is the So try to pronounce It sounds like you're flirting with somebody, but or sort of being caressed, but it's a nasal sound, right? And it's when we think about our shorthand, our metonymy for speaking of language is always a tongue, mother tongues. What is your mother tongue? Sometimes some languages say father tongues, like in Polish, but it's always a tongue. And what we're interested in is to what extent other organs can represent a certain resistance to this hegemony or the tongue. The nose is a site of resistance because, first of all, the nose, when I hear I think, for me, it sounds, again, maybe I'm just prejudiced, but it's like a gong. It's the most Asian-sounding thing in the Turkish language. For example, if you don't believe me, go to Wikipedia. There's an entry of the more than 10 million Chinese men who have the first name is transliterated in English as NG. If you go to a Chinese restaurant and you want to order the water spinach, it's called choy, right? Is resolutely Asian, and it's not a coincidence, again, whether it was conscious or not. It happens that this is the sound that he ditches when he wants to westernize his alphabet and his language. So all across the Turkish language, you had this So for example, even when you see common words like deniz, which means sea, Deniz Bank, used to be daniz. So when you write, and in fact, if you go east, the further you go east in the Turkic languages, all the way to sort of Uzbekistan and Xinjiang, they still have this And in fact, the Turkic-speaking people of the East make fun of the Turks of Anatolia as kind of people who speak with the mouth and not who speak with the throat and the nose. And this NG was you can still find a little bit traces of it in sort of inland Turkey, but it's dying out definitely. And it used to be this letter, the kaf, the K, with 3 dots. And it's something that maybe somebody here who speaks Arabic could help me with, is I've never understood why it is when the Arabic script wants to mark something as foreign, it adds 3 dots to it. So for those of you who speak Persian or Urdu, you know that P, my name, Payam, doesn't exist in Arabic because there's no P in Arabic. And the P also has 3 dots. So in Arabic countries, people will call me Bayam, where you order Bebzi and not Pepsi. And then when you go to Dubai and you see the way that Louis Vuitton is transliterated, it's using the Vav with 3 dots. I don't know why this 3 dot has become a sort of a sign of foreignness in the same way that the DSCH is in German. And so the second sort of follow-up to Ch was a book we published called Naughty Nasals, which looks at the nose as a site of resistance in the Polish language as well, because the Poles are one of the few Slavic languages that have nasal letters, which famously the ow and ow on the A and E here with a sort of sedi on it. And in fact, when the Russians wanted to Cyrillicize the Polish language briefly in the late 19th century, they stumbled upon this question of how do we Cyrillicize letters that don't exist in Cyrillic, because there is no nasal sound in Russian. And the nasal, actually, what the Russians and the Soviets did, what the Soviets did was that they used a policy of divide and conquer when they Cyrillicized the different Muslim subjects. So they would give the same sound, different letters, the same phoneme, different graphemes, because they didn't want the different republics to be able to kind of be mutually intelligible. So the Tajiks, the Turkmens, the Uzbeks, the Azeris all got a different letter for the same sound here, which is J. So again, the J that we talked about earlier, these are all different Js, just sort of contrived, because again, the Russian also doesn't have a J. The Cyrillic doesn't have a J. And so we decided to do a piece called a nose twister, which would be really trying to do, how do we hit both notes, like kind of the splits that I talked about, the N of the niyahat with the N of And we took the nose of the wife of a very famous Azeri, beautiful Turkic nose, and made a piece that people can sort of sit on and use. That's literally doing the kind of the twists or the splits of these 2 ends. I'll end with an anecdote, a story about one of the interesting stories of why certain transliterations are successful and others aren't. And it's actually an article, a very interesting article about script charisma that Ilker Ayturk at Birkent University talks about, he compares the Hebrew and both Hebrew and the Turkish attempts to Latinize, because in fact, it's quite little known, but there was an attempt to Latinize the Hebrew language. Most of you here, I'm sure, are familiar with the fact that Hebrew as a everyday language is a recent phenomenon, right? It was a liturgical language, but it's really the Zionist initiative to make Hebrew an everyday transactional language in the late 19th century. But who were these Zionists who were doing this? They were European Jews. And European Jews, of course, were reading and writing in Latin, Hungarian, German, Polish Jews. And the reason why Ilker Ayturk says that he kind of he creates metrics of why certain language, certain alphabet shifts work and others don't. The reason why Hebrew didn't work and Turkish worked is that you have to have an inferiority complex vis-a-vis the script you're changing to. Jews, early Hebrew speaking, or let's say 19th century, early 20th century European Jews didn't have an inferiority complex towards the Latin alphabet the way the Turks did with the defeat of the First World War and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Second is, of course, the number of literacy, the percentage of literacy you have. Jews in the early 20th century were already at 25% literate in Palestine. Turks were only at 5% literate. So it's much easier to change a script if less people read and write that alphabet. And I'll end with just a quote by Marshall McLuhan, who writes about the Greek myth about the alphabet was that Cadmus, reputedly the king who introduced the phonetic letters into Greece, sowed the dragon's teeth, and they sprang up as armed men. Languages are filled with the testimony to the grasping, devouring power and precision of teeth. That the power of letters as agents of aggressive order and precision should be expressed as extensions of the dragon's teeth is natural and fitting. Letters are not only like teeth visually, but their power to put teeth into the business of empire building is manifest in our Western history. Thank you very much for your patience.
Fascinating speech. Thank you very much. I just wanted to defend linguistics as a linguist. And just to clarify for the audience, because I'm sure you yourself know that linguistics isn't just phonetics and phonology, but also you can study a lot of other things that are fascinating. Historical linguistics, looking into why languages change. You can study sociolinguistics, which is also fascinating. Accents, and look into language prejudice, for instance, these days, very fascinating as well. Political discourse, less fascinating, having Trump and other interesting characters on the scene, but yeah, just wanting to...
Of course. No, I was just being provocative.
I know, sorry to focus on that little thing.
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, linguistics has swallowed philology to a certain extent, but it's, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Sorry if this is a banal question, but I was just wondering if you could talk a tiny bit about the shift of you guys from a reading group into producing artworks. And yeah, what happened with that and the legacy of the group?
So yeah, it took me a long time to understand. I mean, that only until recently, actually, I didn't understand that if you give people the chance not to read, they will not read. And I know that sounds obvious in retrospect, but in the first 3 or 4 years, everything that we did was somehow linked very clearly to the act of reading. It was on paper, print. And why did we change, or not change, but why did we add why did it kind of proliferate? I don't know exactly why, and I'm not the only person, of course, in the collective, so I can only answer from my own way of looking at it. I think one of the reasons was what I was saying was that it's this ability to kind of occupy both ends of the spectrum. For me, a successful artwork is when you can read very different, literally, like you can look at a work and think it's reactionary, and somebody else can argue that it's radical, or it's left and it's right at the same time. And you don't know that kind of slipperiness, and it happens very rarely. In writing, that's hard to do because, at least for us, to write or to speak in lectures, because you end up contradicting yourself. But if I do, for example, I can talk about a piece where we had a piece, I maybe have it here, where we recorded the translation of for 20 years in Turkey, the call to prayer was translated into Turkish. It's quite controversial. How do you translate Allahu Akbar? How do you translate questions of like unicity of God into a tradition which was pre-Islamic, because the Turkish language? How do you you had to use Tanri, again the ng Tanri, which means the great sky, and this was looked upon by some as kind of I could argue that I believe in the indigenization of a language, so you should be able to understand what you're saying. Why not translate the Arabic call to prayer into every language? But we know that the Arabic call to prayer, wherever you are, Indonesia, Iran, Kuwait, doesn't matter, it's always in Arabic. And I could also argue the other side, which is that, again, language doesn't have to be always an analytical process. It can be a non-analytical experience. And I think that maybe in creating installations or works, there was an ability to kind of occupy that range of polemics that we couldn't do only with writing. That's maybe one reason. But we never abandoned, of course, the idea of the reading group or the reading, but we are definitely refocusing on it in the sense that, I've noticed recently that people look at our books within our installations or exhibitions as an afterthought, and that horrifies me because it's not a catalog. So how do you, and that's the real challenge, is how do you, in this day and age, put the act of reading, maybe not literally the act of reading, but the idea of the collective approach to text, right? For the most of the history of the book or of publishing has been a collective experience. It's really a relatively recent 150-year-old phenomenon of the individual, my book, your book. And I would like to revisit that the constituting a social body through reading. And we're having to just kind of force it back into the middle of the conversation. And that's not easy. The sad thing is that with increased commissions and budgets, you can't say, oh, I want to just do more research and more publications. We were talking about this earlier, but institutions want return on their investment or bang for their buck. You can't say, I'm just going to do better research, more extensive publications. No, there has to be kind of a different way to look at it. So that's part of the one of the challenges we're looking at today.
Hey, your talk was really cool. I was just wondering, could you clarify the bit where you were saying how people from like 3 different generations could, what was it, they speak the same thing but read the language differently? I didn't quite
yeah. So
understand
it goes to the language shifts of the former Soviet sphere. So because the alphabet was changed 3 times, twice by the Soviets, and once when most of these countries became independent, they have, let's say, the older generation who can still read and write Arabic. I mean, they're obviously quite old, not many of them are alive anymore, but you still have. And then, let's say, the mid-century, our parents' generation who reads and writes in Cyrillic, but it's all the same language. And then our generation is primarily, well, maybe your generation, I'm a bit too old, but the people born after the mid-80s and onwards are mostly Latin reading and writing, whether they're Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Azeris. And that's why there's this kind of, this idea of you basically become an immigrant within your own language, which is a strange phenomenon because you're cut off. I mean, the strangest thing for me about Turkey is, and I hope I don't offend any Turks here, I think our best commissions and engagements have been in Turkey, funny enough. But I've always found it fascinating how nationalist Turkey is, despite the fact that they have no access to their own history. Like no Turk can read anything that's older than 80 years old. Very, very few Turks can read and write Ottoman Turkish or the Arabic script. In fact, when I speak to teachers of Ottoman Turkish in Turkey, they say that there's such a psychological prejudice against it in the way that you're raised, because you're raised to believe that the Latin is better. So this kind of secular Kemalist idea that several of them have said that it's easier to teach Ottoman Turkish to foreigners than it is to teach it to Turks themselves. So it's weird, because normally nationalism is this kind of perversion of history, and in Turkey's case, it's a kind of almost like a futurist nationalism. It's like purely looking forward. And of course, Erdogan has revisited that Ottoman legacy and with quite mixed results in his foreign policy, of course. But by and large, it's, yeah.
Hey, hello. I also thought it was cool. I've got two questions. One is if I'd be interested if you could talk a little bit about your own practice and in terms of performance, because I was at a performance lecture and I'd just like to know how you think about that or how you approach that. And the other is if you could just talk a little bit about your decision to show an image of Muhammad, because obviously you'd have put a lot of thought into that too.
Yeah, it's, well, first of all, the image of Muhammad is contested because not only, on many levels, one is that it shows that I'm a Shia, first of all, because I don't have problems with figuration. Shias, so you know the dummies approach to Shiism and Sunnism is that we Shias as the minority, the accusation Sunnis make of Shias is that we re-Christianized Islam. And I can show you an example of this, which is kind of uncanny, it's kind of interesting, is that basically you know, every religion comes, I believe, in as a kind of commentary on what precedes it, right? And one of the commentaries of Islam vis-a-vis Christianity was the idolatry, right? And the figuration, which is why we have the prohibition of figuration in Islam. Now, Shias reintroduced this figuration, and they did so, we have all these saints in Shia Islam. And so, of course, you have the 12 apostles, and we also have 12 imams. And there's a lot of different parallels between Catholicism and Shiism, which is actually one of the chapters in our Polish Shiite Showbiz cycle and book. Just like Jesus is supposed to come back at the end of time, we have the hidden imam on the left, the Mahdi, who's also going to come back at the time. So the Sunnis accuse us of being of re-Christianizing Islam, reintroducing the mystery back into Islam. And I totally understand them, because I spent 4 months in Abu Dhabi in a residency in NYU there. And Abu Dhabi is, the Gulf, for me, real Islam, I mean, this is not my I don't like this Islam, but if I want to be kind of doctrinaire about it, true Islam, I believe in the idea that faiths are related to a topography or landscape. And you can understand better Islam if you really spend time in the Gulf, because the Gulf's topography is a severe topography, right? Iran is not a desert landscape. Iran is loads of water, bodies of water, it's mountainous, it's got snow. But you understand kind of the prohibitions on figuration, for example. And now when I look at Iranian mosques, after spending time in the Gulf, it's like I used to look at Indian places of worship. They're almost too colorful for me. You know, there's a kind of, this idea of unicity is really also something which can be formally implemented, right? And it is formally implemented. So, first of all, that's one way why it's contested. The other is that my father and I disagree about whether that's a picture of Muhammad or Ali. And that's another reason why Sunnis don't like Shias, is they think that we think that Ali is a prophet, but the son-in-law of Muhammad, but of course we don't think he's a prophet. He's just like a gatekeeper or a gateway. So he's a saint, but he's not a prophet. Anyway, and this, of course, also, if you've seen the show at the Backlit, it also has to do with another stupid medium is the monobrow, right? You can tell a lot about culture relationship to facial hair. In the Middle East, this is like a sign of virility and beauty, and in the West, I can tell you from experience, if you have a monobrow, your life is over. I mean, forget it. Like no friends, boyfriends, girlfriends. You better shave these hairs, these unfortunate hairs, and then they never come back. Even now it's fashionable, they just won't go back. You know, it's they're angry at me still for giving in. What was the second question? Sorry. It was about performance. Yeah, I can give a very cynical answer to that question. I don't know if I can give a less. The cynical answer to that question is I think that we've accepted the label lecture performance because institutions have put it on us. And I think maybe Sam can speak further about this. My reading of it is that if you say something is a lecture, people will think it's boring. And if you say it's a lecture performance, people will think it's more interesting somehow. Honestly, I mean, and for good reason, is that I went to an academic lecture last night. I drove halfway across Berlin to get there at 6. I had a lot of work to do, and I got there and it was horrible. the subject matter is great, but most people don't know how to speak publicly. And I don't understand why you do public lectures if you don't know how to speak. Just send me the PDF. I'll read it in my bathtub. There's no reason, I mean, unless there's a kind of an important live element to it, and it's not a talent, it's just practice. You just have to practice speaking. I mean, I could say that the only performative element I see in our work is the way we treat textual material. So the way we let's have a transversal, or like to use Chlednikov's way, the transrational approach to a certain text or exegesis or interpretation. That's the only thing I see as performative, really. Maybe that's enough, I don't know.
Hi, I've just been to Germany, and I came across an article about your show in Dresden. And I was also invited to come here, so it was very interesting. So I would like to know, was this show originally in English? How did you transfer it to German, to a German literary content? And did it involve a process of transliteration, maybe? And how was it received in Germany, the whole thing of the jihad and...
So the exhibition, I don't have images here. Well, the exhibition, first of all, was named, we did transliterate, so the name of the exhibition was Made in Germany, but DSCH. And one thing I really like about this show, and it's really thanks to the curator who initiated that, is that all the material around the exhibition, meaning like the posters in the city, the peripheral kind of collateral material, was all using German words that are not spelled with DSCH, but put with the DSCH. So like jet lag, gentrification, Gentrifizierung, not jungle fever, sorry, that is spelled with DSCH, jogging shoe, mini job. So there's a kind of, this was a kind of, let's say the marketing campaign around the show, the communication around the show incorporated this element of the show, which I think is actually just as interesting as the show itself. And what we were talking earlier about this is that one of the premises of the show is challenging this idea of Germany as a Western Enlightenment nation, because it's not. That's the way that Germany presents itself, especially after the war, but it's not the full picture of German history and culture, right? Whether it's from Romanticism or the Sturm und Drang or Hamann or Steiner or Hesse. There's been an equally important non-rational, anti-rational relationship or intellectual tradition in Germany, which is not all to be blamed for National Socialism. So that was kind of one also, if you start to think about, again, it's also addresses Germany's role in the world today, is that Germany is being forced to play this, it has a responsibility to play a leadership position, but it's not willing to do so, because it's really sort of, because of its history, it's how would I say it? It's drank the Kool-Aid, as we say in English, of being a Western country. It believes it's a Western country. But again, Hamann was from Königsberg. Königsberg is in present-day Kaliningrad in Russia. Germany is equally, in my opinion, an Eastern European country as it is a Western European country. And part of the exhibition was trying to sort of activate that in Dresden, where you have this Islamophobia and you have this sort of right-wing resurgence. The exhibition, Dresden is a very interesting place because, and if you haven't been, I was really thinking about, like, it really shows the limits of our ignorance, because young people don't go to Dresden. Dresden is a place where you have millions of tourists a year, but they're all a certain sort of retirement age, Central European or European retired tourists. Not your most hip tourists in the world, let's say, right? Young people go to cities it's the opposite of ruin porn. Do you know this term, ruin porn? Ruin porn, it's good that you don't know. It shows that you're a wise woman. Because ruin porn is a recent phenomenon where young people go to cities like Detroit and they gawk at the fact that it's abandoned buildings and destroyed, and they went to the Balkans in the 90s because they're fascinated by the kind of the sexiness of ruins. Dresden is the opposite, because Dresden has been impeccably restored, in my opinion. Okay. Problematic, sure, some of it's problematic, but the fact is it's been very well restored, so it's almost the opposite of ruin porn. And that's not cool or sexy, but it's got amazing collections. the problem is that the people who go to Dresden don't really go to contemporary exhibitions. That's not known for a contemporary art show. And that was, I think that the show has been quite well received despite that, because for me it's always a good sign when invigilators of an exhibition like an exhibition. Because what we try to do is I sometimes wonder whether we're not popular artists in the kind of true sense, meaning populist a little bit, but not populism is the idea of revanchist populism. And I take the idea of populism from the way that C.R. Majani, an Iranian conceptual artist, actually describes it as literally making the highest achievements of mankind more available, not necessarily accessible. So it's easy to speak to an art audience because we know that art audience. We know that language that they speak. We know the kind of codes. What's much more difficult is to speak to the art audience and to the normal layman's audience. And I think that the show in Dresden does that because the audience has been engaging with it. And again, there's no art audience to speak of. It's not Berlin. There's nobody that goes to contemporary shows in Dresden. So its audience is purely a layman's audience. So did we translate? Translated, and I mean, yeah, my goal maybe is in a couple of years, hopefully, to be able to do this lecture in German. I can do it in Russian and French. I can't do it in German. And I regret that because I believe that if you live somewhere and you don't speak the language, excuse my vulgarity, but it's kind of like sleeping with somebody, not kissing them. You're kind of just passing through. And Germany is not a one-night stand kind of country, you know? It's definitely a slow learning curve, and the challenge, of course, is you can't learn German in Berlin. It's just not possible. You have to go to any other place but Berlin, and you can learn German.
Hi, I'm over here. I was just intrigued by a almost throwaway statement you made about, is it Turk and Tatar, and you didn't know what you weren't sure what the difference was, the definition of that was.
No, I know the difference between Turks and Tatars.
Or is it Slav and Tatar?
No, there was so the jihad was actually published in a language also called Turco-Tatarish, which I don't understand what that is because they were, I guess, trying to speak to the Turkic peoples, but Tatar is different than Turkish, and yeah.
Okay, something I can look up, I guess.
Yeah. But you mentioned the Tatars of our name actually is interesting because, again, it's this, like Nasruddin, this idea of using idiocy to challenge wisdom. Tatar is a word that is still sometimes used, but is definitely used as a catch-all term for all the brown people of that region that Westerners didn't know where they were from. So in the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, the only brown people that Westerners understood was Persians, Arabs in that region. Persians, Arab, Turks, maybe Armenians, and everybody else was just called Tatars. So like if you were Dagestani or Uzbek, you would just call it Tatar. So I would say it's an insult term. At the same time, it's a real term because there are real Tatars. And so it plays with this kind of, again, this stupidity and seriousness that I guess you can find in a lot of our work.
Hi. At the start of the talk, you were talking about typing Russian using the Latin alphabet, which I also have to do. But it made me think about how English words are then transliterated into Russian. And when things like Facebook or McDonald's or brand names, how do you think that sort of transliteration or adoption of the English words into Russian sort of sits with like Russian nationalism today, or kind of the resurgence of that Russian identity?
Mm-hmm. I mean, sadly, in our bio, we talk about this idea, this space called Eurasia, right? There's a movement called Eurasianism, which you're probably familiar with, and in this period, in the past 20 years, it's been a kind of a revanchist, illiberal movement led by a gentleman named Dugin, who used to be the NATO ambassador of Russia to NATO, and but the problem with Eurasianism is it's a ruse historically, even in the early 20th century. Actually, early linguists like Jakobson, Roman Jakobson, I guess is the god in your world, right? Mine as well. Roman Jakobson was an early Eurasianist, but always underlying all this Eurasianism was the idea that Russia is at the center of Eurasianism, right? So it's like, oh, it's like pan-Slavism. Let's all be friends and brothers, but Russia is number one, and then everybody else is sort of down there. And this is what we challenge. We never actually deal with Russia per se, which is, I mean, it's not articulated as such, but that's the fact, is that why would we address Russia when there's so much attention already, right? We're interested in things that are not, right, being highlighted or studied enough. So there is definitely this recent pushback, and in fact there was a stupid Wall Street Journal article about it yesterday or 2 days ago about Russia's turning east, and these tropes that we still use of because Russia's turning east, that's why it's becoming illiberal, and it's much more complex than that. Is that it's the same reason why we look at faith so much. Is that, you know, I'm highly suspicious of consensus, and there are certain consensi, I guess I don't know what we call it, consensuses in our world, which is, you know, one is that Russia is an enemy, even whether, especially today in the left, is like Russia is kind of new McCarthyism. Another one is that faith is always reactionary. I don't believe these things. Actually, I think it's in fact, or that Islam is necessarily gender fluid phobic and homophobic. It's actually, whenever there's a consensus, I think that's the place to redeem. So in fact, you could look at Islam as being more gender fluid tolerant and more tolerant of homosexuality than Western traditions until recently. In fact, we imported homophobia from colonial traditions. There was no homophobia in Iran until the Brits and the French arrived. Iranian men, the idea of beauty in Islam and in Iranian Islam was adult man, woman, and young boy, like the Greeks traditionally. And it was only when Iranians and Persians began to feel insecure with the arrival of more technically proficient, technologically advanced European nations that and they started to call us they started to make fun of us as being gay, and we said, oh, so we interiorized that and took it over and and made it even worse. So now Iran, of course, is more homophobic as a government than most Western nations. So anyway, I think this idea of it's interesting to appropriate those ideas that are necessarily considered to be destructive and find the constructive or progressive agency within those very ideas. And that's part of what we try to do with sort of the Eurasianism.
Hi. In a couple of your books, there's a few terms which you use. I'm really interested in. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about one kind of came across when you were talking about the Shia Showbiz projects, and that's syncretism, and I guess that comes across in the not Moscow, not Mecca work as well, but and that idea of things at the edge of empires being the most kind of interesting place, and that's where the most important ideas happen. I wonder if you could expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, syncretism is a very interesting way to think about our region because of its marginal sort of in-betweenness. It for example, even the pictures, I don't know if in some of the images I showed of this desert landscape with the flags fluttering in the beginning. Those are shrines to Muslim saints in Xinjiang, right? But they look entirely Buddhist or Tibetan because the first Muslims to arrive in Western China were in fact Sufis that were kind of on their own, like sort of ascetics, taking Islam to the eastern frontier, and they were incorporating other elements of Hinduism and Buddhism that they were encountering. And in fact, this is a very important shrine in Bukhara. The largest Sufi tariqat or order is a shrine. At the shrine, there's a mulberry tree. Now, if you a doctrinaire Muslim, you know that the one thing in Islam you can't negotiate. Everything else is negotiable, especially if you're Shia. You can even drink alcohol if you're being persecuted. You can have, you can act like you're not a Muslim. You can do all these things, but the one thing which is non-negotiable is the idea of unicity of God, the Tawhid. And this is, of course, challenging that, right? Is that praying at a petrified mulberry tree. Why syncretism is interesting for us is that syncretism operates a kind of, it becomes like an open code, both in time and in space. So not only are you incorporating things which precede you and or even succeed you, right? But you're incorporating not only spatial sort of neighbors, neighboring religions, neighboring ideologies, neighboring thoughts and belief systems, but temporal ones. So it's a kind of collapse of time and space that allows for a very thick present in some sense, and I think that, yeah, I mean, in our maybe it's just a bias, but like you said, we think that the center is usually, it's sort of, it's rotting in some sense, you know. It's really the edges where these bleeding of one into another takes place, and that's what interests us the most, is where Islam sort of passes as Buddhism, or where Crimean Jews, the Karaites, who take off their shoes when they go into the synagogue and wash their feet because they lived so long with Muslims, so they have adopted Muslim rituals as a kind of dissimulation. And that idea of dissimulation is something that I think we'd like to, and actually other artists, I mean, like Lawrence Abu Hamdan also talks about this taqiyya idea of dissimulation. It's very interesting because it's a kind of, it's a pushback against this constant mantra of integration that we have today with refugees and immigrants and migrants, is that it's all about integration, but what about, you know, what about dissimulation in terms of what about actually acting like you've integrated, but not? Because the question of integration or assimilation is a really problematic one. I mean, in my entire life, I've only met, I can maybe count on 2 hands, immigrants who have managed, in my opinion, to balance that very tricky question of home and host country. Because most of the time they either become host country, they remain tied to their home country and they kind of don't integrate, or they become totally assimilated and they become this kind of, you know, holier than thou, like Trump supporters, sort of like your Iranian Trump supporters. You know, what the hell does that mean? How can you be an Iranian Trump supporter? Right? It's a kind of, or the self-hating Jew. It's the same thing. You know, it's a. I should also say, I guess, that syncretism is, I mean, it's an interesting way to also, I think, maybe to answer the question of identity politics, is that the only way I know of responding to this kind of increased question of identity politics is to accumulate many identities, and sort of until it collapses or implodes. You know, so if you have several affinities or identities, you have to negotiate the conflicts between those identities. In my life, for example, I had to negotiate between being Iranian, American, and a Russian student, and those are 3 enemies, right, historically or present. So you always, it's almost like the way that, you know, the way they make foie gras. You know, you have to kind of stuff the goose until its liver just explodes. I think that's what we have to do with identity politics, is really just accumulate so many that it just sort of, the system sort of dysfunctions. I don't know any other way to really, to combat it.
Just,
yeah.
No, the talk was really interesting, and I've heard some of the similar sort of things been talked about when people talk about India, because the whole idea of India is a Arabic construct and what's authentic and all that type of stuff comes. Now, what made me think, why are you having a conversation between Eurasia and the West and not Eurasia and the South? Or why north-south conversation rather than east-west conversation?
Why not north-south? Is India the global south? I don't know. I mean, I think I don't know, because I know that today the kind of the larger discussion is, and I agree that it's important to think north-south as opposed to east-west. I still am not willing to let go of this east-west, because I think it's, and there's a lot of efforts to kind of say that, even with this kind of curatorial thing, the former West, there's a lot of arguments that somehow it's all the European Union now, we're all the same. There is no Eastern Europe. Even Eastern Europeans don't want to be called Eastern Europeans anymore, right? There's like Central Europeans. And the only Eastern European left is Russia and Ukraine. So one day I'm sure they will be part of Europe, and then Iran will be Eastern Europe. I don't understand this. I think it's important to still highlight the differences, and not highlight the difference, but like still acknowledge the differences structurally between Eastern and Western Europe, whether it's financially or whether it's politically. The global south is another way to think about that, and I think that sometimes we're lumped into the global south because Central Asia, somehow Muslims are considered south, but Belarusians aren't. And I don't know, I think that in fact, this East-West division is something that it's not, again, I try not to take it literally, is the idea is that the East, if you think about it, even spiritually, and like people like Sohrawardi, a really amazing 12th century scholar or writer who was a kind of illuminationist, he talked about this idea of occidental exile, or even in Greek, you have this cognitio mutantis, sort of the morning of knowledge, that the sun rises in the East and sets in the West. I don't think it literally means that the West is declining, like Spengler said, because it's in the West and the sun sets there. But the idea that the East has certain things to teach us, the same way the South has certain things to teach us, that we've been living, as we know, in a Western-dominated world for however many hundred years. And just, it's not about rejecting that model, as opposed to, again, I would say accumulating different models. And that's why we, in fact, started Slavs and Tatars, it was simply a question of, why are we learning the same thing no matter where we are? Whether you're in Jakarta and Tehran and Moscow and Heidelberg and Harvard, you're learning, everybody has the same curriculum. I find that really depressing. It's not a conspiracy. There's no enlightenment conspiracy. It's just that we've all swallowed this enlightenment line of thinking and genealogies. And there should be as many different approaches to knowledge as there are places of knowledge. And that's really why that's really the kind of, that goes to the origins of what we do and why we do it, because that's why we never talk about the similar, I mean, there's a kind of similar characters in art language. We don't ever talk about Deleuze and Agamben and all these people that everybody's read. I don't think it's interesting. I think it's much more interesting to talk about, when I'm reading something, I want to learn names that I don't know, not names that I already know. And so we're always looking for these scholars or people like Hamann or Norman Brown or Goldziger, people that, or Sohrawardi, that are not being taught to us no matter where you study, because they just simply fall by the wayside of these canons of thought. Thank you.